chronic inflammation, it turns out, is the source of most chronic disease. No matter how you look at it biologically, you find sources of chronic inflammation.
Hello, everyone. We welcome today Dr. Robert Hansen, practicing physician, author of the popular blog, practicalevolutionaryhealth.com. And his blog is dedicated to health, nutrition, and lifestyle from an evolutionary perspective. And Dr. Hansen is also a jazz pianist. We'll talk about that as well. So we talk about the reason why chronic inflammation is called a silent killer, how to identify danger signs, how to reduce the risk of this disease. So Dr. Hansen, welcome. Great to have you on our podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Inflammation has become recently a hot topic for research and also for medical doctors. And can you also explain what diseases does chronic inflammation typically lead to?
Almost every chronic disease that you can think of. So we think of diabetes and metabolic syndrome, two very important problems in our society, especially in the developed world. So metabolic syndrome is a problem that exists. It's defined as having 3 or more of high blood pressure, obesity, insulin resistance with high blood sugar, high triglycerides, and low HDL, which is the so-called protective cholesterol, which is a very bad name for it. And so if you have 3 out of 5 of those, you have what's called metabolic syndrome, which is prediabetes. And as it turns out, metabolic syndrome is a significant risk factor for just about every other chronic illness you can think of. Anything from cancer to heart attacks to strokes to depression, psychiatric illness. The deeper you look at any chronic diseases, the more you find that insulin sensitivity and the opposite of that, insulin resistance, is linked. And this is because the metabolic processes at the cellular level, how we create energy, is fundamental to how our body works. And when that becomes disrupted, everything else is a problem. Think of dirty gasoline in a car tank, okay? So if you've got problems with energy production, your engine won't run well. So it turns out that the problem with metabolism and having a clean source of energy versus a dirty source of energy goes well beyond that energy production. It goes on to turning on genes. So for many years, science considered genetic predisposition for diseases. And although that's a very important factor of what genes we have, what we get from our parents, it turns out that that governs only 20 to 30% of our biology. 60, 70, probably 80% of our biology is determined by what's called epigenetic factors, which means how our environment turns on genes and turns off genes and modulates their expression. So epigenetic science became very popular 10 to 20 years ago. And that basically involves understanding how all of those lifestyle factors influence turning on genes and turning off genes. So living in the developed world, it turns out, became a health issue for many reasons, but the 2 primary reasons were the introduction of terrible foods into our society and the introduction of environmental pollution, which now is worldwide. The third factor that occurred in the developing world was stress. Stress related to disruption of families. The extended family was lost as people to find work would travel long distances, relocate, and it would separate the strong family unit. Or obesity has become an epidemic. This preponderance of immune cells as you grow more fat around your belly causes a chronic inflammatory state. Other risk factors include shift work. If you work during the night and try to sleep during the day, that completely disrupts your biological clock. And there's a central biological clock in the brain that communicates with every organ and with every cell in your body. And this biological clock is related to the rising and the falling of the sun. And so it cycles with the sun. And there are hormones in your body, there are genes that cycle with the rhythm of the sun. And then people that work very stressful jobs, that work too many hours, this is a risk factor. People that suffer from social inequality to the degree that they are challenged, that they have food insecurity, the stress of food insecurity has multiple implications. So all of these are high risk for inflammatory disease. The cultural context of fast food, of highly refined processed food, the lack of availability of more natural whole foods.
So what are the danger signs or typical symptoms which may signal a chronic inflammation?
There are many. A chronic fatigue, so-called brain fog, inability to think or remember. Of course, obesity, high blood pressure, anxiety disorders. These are becoming increasingly common in our society. But high blood pressure and high resting heart rate. And there's something called heart rate variability, the variation in the heart rate between beat to beat, heartbeat. So heart rate, blood pressure, body mass index, or the ratio of your waistline to your height, these are all indicators of chronic inflammation.
And how about typical biomarkers of chronic inflammation?
Well, blood tests, yes. CRP is a protein that's produced when there's more inflammation, there's more CRP floating in your blood. This is a known risk factor for heart attack, strokes, cardiovascular disease. Something called ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate, is a marker of inflammation, which is used by rheumatologists. Various autoimmune diseases and non-autoimmune chronic arthritis diseases are associated with elevated ESR. Those are two blood markers. You can get into more sophisticated markers, but most of them are not typically used in a routine evaluation. Chronic elevations in what's called the serum ferritin, which is a measure of the amount of iron in your blood. We know that excessive iron load in the body causes inflammation. And we know that a response to stress is often associated with an elevated serum ferritin level. Zinc, which is a very important essential mineral, often drops precipitously under conditions of chronic stress, as does magnesium. So functional medicine physicians who look at root cause of disease often will investigate the essential minerals such as zinc and magnesium levels, copper levels. The ratio of zinc to copper is very important relative to chronic inflammation in the body, and they should be roughly equal. Other markers that would be important to investigate would be a level of omega-3 fats in your, not just in your blood, but in your tissues, and this can be easily and cheaply evaluated what's called an omega-3 index, where the ratio of the omega-3 fats, which are the anti-inflammatory fats that come from fish and seafood, is compared to the ratio of, to the level of omega-6 fats. And this is typically done in red blood cells, which will give you a marker for what your dietary intake has been over the past 3 or 4 months, similar to the hemoglobin A1C, giving you an indicator of what your blood sugar has been doing for the past 3 or 4 months.
What, from your perspective, are the most efficient, natural or non-medication ways to address chronic inflammation?
So, first I would talk about sleep, because sleep deprivation can kill you quicker than starvation. Sleep is so fundamentally important, and most modern societies people are chronically sleep deprived. One night of poor sleep will slow your reflexes as much as intoxication with alcohol. And chronic sleep deprivation is so deleterious to our health. So good sleep habits. The most important part of sleep habits and improving your circadian rhythm involve getting early morning outdoor light exposure to your eyes, and in the evening reducing artificial light, especially light that hits your eyes from computer screens, TV screens, etc., so that you don't get what's called stage 4 deep restorative sleep. It's during stage 4 deep restorative sleep, when your brain waves slow down the most, that your body tissues repair, that you fight inflammation, that your immune system gets boosted so that it can fight cancer. So, and that your blood sugars are regulated. There's so many important processes are rejuvenated during stage 4 restorative sleep. So anything that interferes with what we call normal sleep architecture, which means your ability as an adult to cycle through stage 1 through stage 4 and remain long enough at stage 4, anything that interferes with that will dramatically affect your health. So I would say number 1 is sleep. And that relates to exposure to light and the appropriate amount of light at the appropriate amount of time. The other thing that impacts sleep, very importantly, is when you eat. So there's this concept called time-restricted eating, where you limit the time during the day when you eat so that you have a longer overnight fast. And specifically, you do not eat anything for at least 3 hours before you try to go to sleep. Then food. Oh my goodness, we could talk about this forever. One of my favorite topics. But basically, eating whole foods. Eating foods that do not have added sugar, which is 70% of what you find in a grocery store now, added sugar in one form or another. And there are now over 30 different words used on food labels to describe various kinds of sugar to try and hide the fact that there's sugar added. So you have to be very careful. Any food that contains more than one ingredient is a processed refined food. So if you look at a label and you see more than one ingredient, you shouldn't be eating it. That means you eat whole foods, vegetables and fruits and meat and fish and eggs and nuts that's just one ingredient, right? Once you start getting into more than one ingredient, it's becoming refined and processed, and the greater the number of ingredients, the more refined and processed it is. So the vegetable oils, the added sugar, and then the refined flour foods. Now, if you just eliminated those, the whole world's health would improve dramatically. But let's dive a little deeper, because autoimmune diseases are becoming more and more common. So the concept of evolutionary biology suggests that we should examine what hunter-gatherers eat. And there are diminishing numbers of hunter-gatherer societies remaining in the world because of the intrusion of modern society. But if you read the work of early missionaries and read the work of early anthropologists, it was noted that people that were living hunter-gatherer style lifestyles had tremendously low levels of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart attack, strokes, and cancer. It's profound. All the early observations of these populations demonstrated that. And it also demonstrated that when you introduced modern Western foods, when you introduced flour foods, when you introduced grains, especially refined grains, when you introduced sugar, and when you introduced unnatural oils, those populations became sick and started developing the same diseases that we have. So the paleo diet evolved out of this concept, and then eliminates grains, legumes, dairy, and all processed foods, added sugar. So it consists of simply eating organic vegetables, organic fruits to avoid the environmental toxins, grass-fed and grass-finished meat. And biologically, we know that the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in your body and your tissue cells is a strong predictor for dying, for example, from sudden death associated with a heart attack.
I understand.
If you have a heart attack and you're walking around with a good ratio, you're 1/3 or less likely to die from that heart attack than you are if your ratio is bad.
Okay.
Okay.
So we talked about, I mean, you talked about sleep, stress management, nutrition. How about exercise?
Exercise, very important. Not too much, not too little. But let's talk about the two general kinds of exercise. Resistance training, which increases muscle mass and strength, and so-called aerobic cardiovascular exercise. So both are important. Both are very important. Sarcopenia is the medical term for not having enough muscle mass. So you can be very thin, but not metabolically healthy if you lack enough muscle. Okay, so muscle, it turns out, is also an endocrine organ. And when you consume calories, particularly sugar and refined carbohydrates, if you've got more muscle mass, your blood sugars are less likely to skyrocket, and therefore your insulin levels in response are less likely to jump to high levels, because your muscles can absorb the sugar and convert it to glycogen. But you want to be doing regular exercise at least 3 times a week for 20 minutes of resistance training. And this small amount of resistance training, which means working against the resistance of bands or lifting weights, and it doesn't have to be tremendous amounts of weights. Okay, even in elderly people, 90 years old, lifting up a 2-pound weight, it can have profound effects on your health.
Your advice will definitely make it a part of this podcast. Again, thanks a lot for joining it and taking the time.
No problem. It was my pleasure.